The rain came sideways across the hill, and Alina Whitmore was already late. She gathered her skirt in one fist and ran the last stretch of gravel path toward Ashford Manor, her boots slipping on wet stone, her breath sharp in her chest. The letter in her coat pocket had promised a carriage waiting at the crossroads. There had been no carriage. She had walked the last 3 miles alone, through mud and wind, because the family who employed her could not be kept waiting on her first day, and a governess who arrived late was a governess who did not stay. The manor rose out of the storm like something carved from the hill itself, gray stone and tall windows, and at the top of a wide stone staircase stood 2 great oak doors, already opening. A man in a dark coat stepped out to meet her, and behind him came the low creak of wheels on wood. Alina did not see the wheelchair until it was too late. Her foot caught the edge of the top step, slick with rain, and the world tilted sideways. She threw out her hands, grasping for anything solid, and found instead a shoulder, an arm, a chest. And then she was falling forward into a lap that was not supposed to be there, into arms that closed around her out of pure reflex. And the 2 of them went still in the doorway of Ashford Manor while the rain hammered down around them. For a moment, neither of them moved. Alina could feel a heartbeat beneath her cheek, fast and startled, and she realized with rising horror that she was pressed against a stranger, a man seated in a wheeled chair, his hands still gripping her arms where he had caught her. She pushed herself upright so quickly she nearly toppled again. "Forgive me, I am so sorry. I did not see the chair, I did not see you, Clearly, the man said. His voice was low and dry, edged with something that was not quite anger and not quite amusement. Alina straightened her cloak and finally looked at him properly. He was younger than she had expected, with dark hair pushed back from a face that might have been handsome if it were not carved so tightly with tension, jaw set, eyes the color of storm clouds fixed on her with an intensity that made her want to step back. His shoulders were broad beneath a well-cut coat, his hands strong where they still rested on the arms of the wheeled chair, but his legs lay still beneath a dark blanket, and Alina understood, with a lurch of embarrassment, exactly whom she had fallen into. The Duke of Ashford, the man the village whispered about, the man no one had seen leave his estate in over a year. "Your Grace," she said, and dropped into a hasty curtsy, water dripping from the hem of her cloak onto the marble floor. "I am Alina Whitmore. I believe I am expected." "You are late," he said. "There was no carriage at the crossroads, Your Grace. I walked." Something flickered across his face, gone before she could name it. He studied her for a long moment, rain-soaked and trembling with cold, and then he looked past her, toward the man in the dark coat who had opened the door. "Finch, see that Miss Whitmore is given dry clothes and a hot meal before she meets my niece." His eyes returned to Alina, cool and unreadable. "We do not make a habit of catching governesses at Ashford Manor." "I trust it will not become one." He turned the wheels of his chair with a sharp motion of his hands and rolled back into the shadow of the hall, leaving Alina standing in the doorway, soaked through, humiliated and strangely unable to stop thinking about the startled beat of his heart beneath her hand. The butler, a tall man with kind eyes and a face that gave away nothing, offered her his arm. "This way, Miss Whitmore. Pay no mind to his Grace. He has not been himself since the accident." "The accident?" "It is not my place to say." Finch guided her down a corridor lined with portraits, their painted eyes seeming to follow her progress. "You will hear the story soon enough. Everyone in this house has their own version of it." Alina was given a small but comfortable room on the 3rd floor, overlooking the gardens, and a maid named Peggy helped her out of her wet things and into a plain gray dress that had been left for her use. Over a bowl of hot soup in the servants' hall, she learned the shape of the household in pieces, the way one learns a house by its creaking floorboards. The Duke, Adrian Ashford, had been thrown from his carriage a little more than a year ago, on the road that ran along the eastern cliffs. The horses had bolted in a storm not unlike the one raging outside now. His younger brother had been riding with him. His brother had not survived. Adrian had woken from the wreck with his legs beneath him and no feeling in them at all, and he had not, as far as anyone in the house could tell, truly woken from it since. He was a different man before, Peggy said quietly, refilling Aliner's bowl though she had not asked. Laughed easy, danced at the harvest ball 2 years running. Now he keeps to his study and his library, and God help the servant who mentions his brother's name. And the little girl I am to teach. Miss Lily, his Grace's niece, his brother's only child. Her mother passed when she was small, and now her father is gone too, so it is only his Grace left to raise her, though I do not think he knows how. Peggy lowered her voice further. She is a sweet thing, but lonely. The last governess left after 3 weeks. Said the house was too sad to bear. Aliner thought of the man in the wheeled chair, his storm-colored eyes and his voice like a closing door, and she did not know whether to feel pity or dread. She finished her soup in silence and told herself that she, at least, did not intend to leave after 3 weeks. She needed this position too badly for that. Her father's debts had followed her even after his death, and there was nowhere else for her to go. That evening, after the rain had softened to a steady patter against her window, Aliner was shown to the nursery to meet her new pupil. Lily Ashford was 7 years old, small and pale, with her uncle's dark hair and a wariness in her eyes that no child so young should have worn. She sat curled on a window seat with a book she was not reading, watching Aliner with the careful suspicion of someone who had learned that people who came into her life did not always stay in it. Good evening, Lily. My name is Miss Whitmore. I am told you like books. The last one left because Uncle Adrian shouted at her, Lily said, without looking up. She said this house made her nervous. Did it make you nervous too? Lily considered this with the gravity of a much older person. No, he does not shout at me. He only shouts when people pity him. She turned a page she had not read. Are you going to pity him? Aliner thought of the moment in the doorway, the startled heartbeat beneath her hand, the sharp retreat of his chair into shadow. I do not know him well enough yet to pity him or admire him, she said honestly, but I think perhaps he does not want either. For the first time, Lily looked up and studied her properly, as though this answer had earned something. You are strange, she said, but there was no unkindness in it, and when Aliner smiled, the corner of Lily's mouth twitched in something that was almost the beginning of a smile in return. Later that night, unable to sleep in the unfamiliar room, Aliner rose and wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and made her way quietly down to the library, thinking she might find something to read until her eyes grew heavy. She did not expect to find the room already occupied. Adrian Ashford sat near the dying fire, his wheeled chair angled toward the flames, a glass of amber liquid untouched on the table beside him. He had not heard her enter. In the firelight, without the guarded tightness he had worn at the door, his face looked different, younger, and unbearably tired, the face of a man carrying something too heavy to set down even for a moment. Aliner stood frozen in the doorway, caught between retreating and speaking, and in that stillness she saw something she suspected he showed no one else in daylight, the raw, unguarded weight of his grief. A floorboard creaked beneath her foot, and his head turned sharply. The tiredness vanished from his face in an instant, replaced by the same cool distance she had met at the door. Miss Whitmore. Do you make a habit of wandering the halls at this hour? Forgive me, Your Grace, I could not sleep. I did not mean to intrude. And yet you find yourself intruding twice in one day. His voice was dry, but there was less bite in it than before, as though the fire and the quiet had worn something down in him. You may as well come in since you are already here. I find I have little patience left tonight for false apologies. Aliner hesitated, then stepped into the room. The fire crackled between them, throwing long shadows across the shelves of books that climbed to the ceiling. I met your niece this evening, she said, choosing the safer subject. She is a remarkable child. She is a lonely child, Adrian said flatly. I have not the first notion how to change that. Perhaps that is not entirely your task alone to carry. His eyes came up to hers, sharp and searching, as if trying to determine whether she meant to lecture him or simply state a fact. You have been in this house less than a day, Miss Whitmore. I would advise against forming opinions so quickly. I do not offer opinions, Your Grace, only observations. She met his gaze without flinching, though her heart beat unevenly in her chest. She told me you do not shout at her, only at those who pity you. Something shifted behind his eyes, a flicker of surprise quickly smothered. And do you intend to pity me, Miss Whitmore? I intend to teach your niece her letters and her sums, your grace, and to see that she smiles more than she does now. What you intend for yourself is not my concern. For a long moment he only looked at her, and the fire popped and settled between them, and outside the rain had finally stopped, leaving the world outside the window washed clean and quiet. Then, unexpectedly, the corner of his mouth curved, not quite a smile, but close enough to it that Elinor felt something loosen in her chest. You are either very brave or very foolish, he said. I have been told both, your grace, usually within the same conversation. This time he did laugh, a short, rusty sound, as though the motion of it was unfamiliar to him, as though it had been locked away somewhere and only just found the door. He caught himself almost immediately, clearing his throat and looking away into the fire, but Elinor had heard it, and she carried the sound with her back up the stairs to her small room on the 3rd floor, turning it over in her mind long after she had blown out her candle. She did not know, lying awake in the dark with the last of the storm dripping softly from the eaves, that the sound of his laughter would return to her again and again in the days that followed, or that the man who had caught her at the door, cold and guarded and grieving, had already begun, without meaning to catch her a second time. Outside, the clouds finally broke apart, and a single star showed through the gap, cold and steady over Ashford Manor, over the sleeping house, over the 2 people inside it who did not yet know how much was about to change. The shouting began before Elinor had even finished dressing. She heard it through the floorboards, a man's voice raised in the study below, sharp and furious, and she abandoned her hairbrush and hurried down the servants' stairs to find the household already in motion, Finch standing rigid outside the study door, Mrs. Bell the housekeeper wringing her hands in the corridor, and Lily pressed small and frightened against the banister at the top of the main staircase. What has happened? Elinor asked, crouching beside the girl. Uncle Gerald, Lily whispered, as though the name itself were dangerous. He came before breakfast. He always makes Uncle Adrian angry. Through the heavy study door, Elinor could hear fragments of the argument, a second man's voice, smoother and colder than Adrian's, needling at something. She caught words like a state and obligation, and a man in your condition, and she saw Finch's jaw tighten at each one. Who is Gerald? She asked quietly. His Grace's cousin, Finch murmured, not taking his eyes from the door. Next in line for the title, should anything happen to his Grace or Miss Lily, he visits more often than is comfortable and always on some pretext of concern. The door burst open before Finch could say more, and a man strode out into the corridor, tall and elegantly dressed, his face composed into an expression of practiced sympathy that did not reach his eyes. He paused when he saw Elinor, his gaze traveling over her with an assessment that made her skin prickle. "And who is this?" he asked, addressing Finch but looking at Elinor. "Miss Whitmore, the new governess, sir." "Ah, the one who fell into my cousin's lap yesterday. The story has already reached the village, Miss Whitmore. You have made quite an entrance." His smile did not warm. "I do hope you are prepared for what this household truly is. My cousin is not an easy man to serve in his current state." "I have found his Grace perfectly reasonable," Elinor said evenly, though her hands had curled into fists at her sides. Gerald's eyebrows rose, amused. "Reasonable. That is not a word I have heard applied to Adrian in some time." He glanced toward the study door, where Adrian's wheeled chair had appeared, his face like carved stone. "Cousin, I only came to discuss the matter of the eastern fields before the season turns." "There is no need to take offense at practical conversation." "There is every need," Adrian said, his voice low and controlled in a way that was somehow more frightening than the shouting had been. "When the practical conversation begins with whether I am fit to manage my own land." "I only meant—" "I know precisely what you meant." Adrian's hands gripped the wheels of his chair, knuckles pale. "You may see yourself out, Gerald, and you may wait for an invitation before you return." Gerald's composure slipped for just a moment, something colder and harder showing beneath it, before he smoothed it back into place with practiced ease. He gave a shallow bow, more mockery than courtesy, and took his leave, his footsteps unhurried on the marble floor, as though he had all the time in the world and knew it. The moment the front door closed behind him, the tension in the corridor did not ease. Adrian sat rigid in his chair, breathing hard, his eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance, and Alina watched Lily shrink further against the banister, small and silent, clearly no stranger to scenes like this one. "Lily," Alina said gently, drawing the girl's attention away, "why do we not begin our lessons in the garden this morning? I find fresh air makes numbers far less tedious." Lily nodded, grateful for the excuse, and slipped her small hand into Alina's, and together they made their way outside, leaving the household to settle back into its uneasy quiet. It was only later, well into the afternoon, that Alina learned the fuller shape of what had happened, from Mrs. Bell, who seemed to regard Alina with a new degree of warmth after witnessing her steadiness during the confrontation. "Master Gerald has been circling this estate like a crow since the accident," Mrs. Bell said, kneading bread dough with more force than the task strictly required. "Always some reason to visit, always some new worry about His Grace's health, His Grace's judgment, whether His Grace is truly capable of managing the estate from that chair. He would have the courts declare His Grace unfit if he thought he could manage it, and take the guardianship of Miss Lily besides. Surely no court would allow such a thing. Perhaps not if His Grace were seen about, attending to his duties, proving himself hale in body if not in legs." Mrs. Bell shaped the dough into a loaf and set it aside to rise. "But His Grace has not left this house in over a year, Miss Whitmore. He has not been seen at the county assembly, nor at church, nor at a single gathering where his cousin might be contradicted by his own two eyes. The longer he hides in that study, the more ammunition he hands to a man who wants nothing more than to see him declared incapable." Alina turned this over in her mind for the rest of the day, through lessons with Lily, through a quiet supper taken alone in her room, and by the time evening fell she found herself once again drawn toward the library, though she told herself it was only to return the book she had borrowed the night before. Adrian was there again, as she had half expected, though tonight his face held none of the softness she had glimpsed by the firelight. He looked up when she entered, and his expression was guarded, wary, as though bracing for another confrontation. "Come to offer more unsolicited observations, Miss Whitmore." "Only if you wish to hear them, Your Grace." "I rarely have a choice in the matter, it seems." But he gestured, almost grudgingly, to the chair across from his own. "Sit, if you intend to stay. I find I have not the energy tonight to argue with someone standing over me." Alina sat, smoothing her skirt, choosing her words with care. "I understand your cousin visited today." "You understand a great deal for someone who has been in this house one full day." "The walls of this house are not especially good at keeping secrets, Your Grace." A tired ghost of a smile touched his mouth, gone as quickly as it came. "No. I suppose they are not." He looked into the fire, and for a moment the guarded mask slipped, revealing something rower beneath it, exhaustion layered over old grief. "Gerald has always coveted what he cannot have. When we were boys it was toys, then it was the attention of our grandfather, and now, apparently, it is a title and a manner that would only come to him over my broken body or my broken mind, whichever fails first." "You do not believe either will fail." "I do not know what I believe any more, Miss Whitmore." He said it plainly, without self-pity, which somehow made the admission land harder than if he had wept over it. "A year ago I could ride from dawn until dusk. I could dance until the candles burned low. I could carry my brother's daughter on my shoulders through this garden, and hear her laugh loud enough to wake the birds. Now I cannot cross this room without a servant's help, and my cousin whispers to the county that I am unfit to raise the very child I promised my brother I would care for." The rawness in his voice caught at something in Alina's chest, and she found herself leaning forward before she had decided to. Then prove him wrong. His eyes came up to hers, sharp and startled. "You make it sound simple." "I do not think it simple, Your Grace. I think it will be very hard and very slow, and you may fail more often than you succeed at first. But I do not think it is impossible, and I do not think you believe it impossible either, or you would not still be fighting your cousin at every turn instead of simply letting him have what he wants." Silence stretched between them, filled only by the crackle of the fire, and Alina wondered if she had overstepped, if he would send her from the room the way he had sent the last governess running after only 3 weeks. Instead, he studied her with an intensity that made her want to look away, and made her unable to do so at the same time. "You are unlike any governess I have employed," he said finally. "I have been told that too, Your Grace, though usually as a complaint rather than a compliment." That startled the laugh out of him again, the same rusty, unpracticed sound from the night before, and this time he did not smother it as quickly. "I begin to suspect you say these things deliberately, Miss Whitmore, to see what reaction you can provoke." "I would never be so calculating, Your Grace." He did not sound convinced, but the tension had eased from his shoulders, and for the rest of the evening, as the fire burned low, and the house settled into its familiar creaks and silences around them, they spoke of smaller things, of Lily's fondness for pressed flowers, of a library that had once belonged to his grandfather, of a village fair that used to be held each autumn before the accident made such outings impossible to imagine. It was well past midnight when Alina finally rose to retire, and at the doorway she paused, looking back at him in the dying firelight. "Your Grace, I do not say this to provoke a reaction. I say it because I believe it to be true." She held his gaze steadily. "Whatever your cousin says of you, the man I have met these 2 days is neither unfit nor incapable. He is only afraid, and I think perhaps he has been afraid for a very long time, and has forgotten that fear and weakness are not the same thing." She did not wait for a reply, retreating up the stairs before he could summon one, her heart hammering against her ribs the entire way, half certain she had gone too far, half certain that she had not gone far enough. Behind her in the library, Adrian Ashford sat very still for a long time, staring at the space where she had stood, turning her words over and over as though searching for the flaw in them, and finding, to his own quiet astonishment, that he could not. A letter arrived on the 3rd morning, and its wax seal alone was enough to drain the color from Finch's face. Alina was crossing the great hall with Lily's slate and chalk tucked under her arm when she saw the butler standing frozen by the front door, the letter held at arm's length as though it might scald him. Mrs. Bell hurried to his side, read the seal, and pressed a hand to her mouth. "What is it?" Alina asked, though something in her chest already told her she would not like the answer. "The county magistrate," Finch said quietly. "It seems Master Gerald has made good on his threat sooner than any of us expected." The letter, once delivered to Adrian's study, produced a silence far more unsettling than the shouting of 2 days before. Alina waited outside with Lily, distracting the girl with a game of counting the carved rosettes along the corridor ceiling, until Finch emerged, his face grim, and asked quietly whether Miss Whitmore might spare a moment for his grace. She found Adrian at his desk, the letter spread open before him, his face pale beneath its usual composure. He did not look up when she entered. "My cousin has petitioned the magistrate to review my fitness to hold guardianship of Lily," he said, in a voice stripped of all warmth. "He has gathered statements, neighbors who have not seen me in over a year, a physician he consulted without my knowledge. He argues that a man who cannot walk, who has not been seen in society, who keeps to one wing of his own house, cannot be trusted with the raising of a child, nor the management of an estate that will one day be hers." "That is monstrous." "That is clever," Adrian corrected, and there was a bitter edge to the word. "Because he is not entirely wrong, Miss Whitmore. I have not left this house. I have not been seen. I have given him a full year of silence to build his case, and I did not even notice I was doing it. There is a hearing. In 3 weeks. At the County Assembly Hall, before the magistrate, and whichever of my neighbors Gerald has convinced to attend and offer their opinions of my condition." He finally looked up at her, and the fear in his eyes was so plainly visible, so unguarded, that Alina's own chest tightened in response. 3 weeks, Miss Whitmore, to somehow prove that I am not the broken, hollowed-out shadow of a man that everyone in this county already believes me to be. Alina crossed the room and sat, uninvited, in the chair across from his desk. Then we have 3 weeks to prove otherwise. Wait. You did not think I intended to sit idle while your cousin attempts to take Lily from the only family she has left, Alina said, and something fierce had crept into her own voice now, surprising even herself. I have grown fond of that child in 3 days, Your Grace. I have no intention of watching her handed over to a man who visits only to threaten her uncle. Adrian studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, a wariness giving slow, reluctant way to something that looked almost like hope, though he seemed unwilling to trust it. And what precisely do you propose, Miss Whitmore? That I simply rise from this chair and walk into the assembly hall on my own 2 legs? The physicians have told me for a year that such a thing is unlikely. My spine was damaged in the fall. It is not a matter of will. I do not propose anything so simple, Alina said carefully. But I do not believe you have truly tried either, not tried in the way that matters. You have accepted what you were told a year ago in the worst days of your grief, and you have not questioned it since, because questioning it means hoping, and hoping is its own kind of pain when you have already lost so much. The silence that followed was long and heavy, and Alina feared she had finally pushed too far, that he would send her from the room and perhaps from the house entirely for her presumption. Instead, when he spoke again, his voice was quieter than she had yet heard it. You speak as though you understand grief. I buried my father 8 months ago, Your Grace, and with him went the last of our family's fortune and most of our friends, who discovered rather suddenly that they preferred us with money attached. I understand something of loss, and something of how it can convince a person that hope is a luxury they can no longer afford. Adrian's gaze did not waver from hers, and something passed between them in that silence, some recognition, one wounded person to another, that seemed to settle the air in the room into something less brittle than it had been. Very well, he said at last. Suppose I agreed to try in whatever manner you imagine trying might look, where would we even begin? With the physician, Alina said, some of the tightness easing from her shoulders now that he had not dismissed her outright. Not the one your cousin consulted behind your back, but one of your own choosing, someone who will examine you honestly and tell you plainly whether the damage is truly beyond hope, or whether a year of stillness and grief has simply been mistaken for permanence. Adrian was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming an uneven rhythm on the arm of his chair. There is a man in Millbrook, Dr. Clark. He attended my brother's household for years before the accident. I have refused to see him since, out of some notion that I did not wish to be pitied by a man who once dined at my table as a friend. Then perhaps it is time to let him see you as something other than an object of pity, Your Grace. Perhaps it is time to let him see you as a man determined to fight for his niece. That evening, Finch was dispatched to Millbrook with a letter requesting Dr. Clark's visit, and Alina returned to the nursery to find Lily curled on her window seat again, watching the last light fade over the gardens with the same wary stillness she always carried. Uncle Gerald is going to take me away, isn't he? Lily said, not looking up. I heard the servants talking. Alina sat beside her carefully, choosing her words. I will not lie to you, Lily. Your Uncle Gerald has asked the magistrate to decide whether your Uncle Adrian ought to remain your guardian. But nothing has been decided yet, and your Uncle Adrian and I intend to see that nothing of the sort happens. You and Uncle Adrian. Lily finally turned to look at her, something quick and searching in her small face. You talked to him at night, in the library, Peggy told me. Alina felt her cheeks warm. We discuss household matters. Peggy says he has not laughed since Papa died, not until you came. Lily's gaze was uncomfortably direct for a child of 7. I think I would like it very much if you stayed, Miss Whitmore, even after the hearing, even after I have learned all my letters. Something in Alina's chest ached at the quiet hope in the girl's voice, and she reached out to smooth a strand of dark hair back from Lily's face. I have no plans to leave you, Lily. Whatever happens at that hearing, I intend to be here. She did not know, saying it, how great a promise it would prove to be, nor how many nights of worry and effort lay ahead before it could be kept. But she said it with a certainty that surprised her. And Lily, for the first time since Eleanor had arrived at Ashford Manor, allowed herself something that was unmistakably a smile. Dr. Clark arrived 2 days later, a stout, gray-haired man with quick, kind eyes and none of the deferential softness Eleanor had expected from a country physician addressing a duke. He examined Adrian thoroughly in the privacy of his rooms, and Eleanor waited outside with attention that surprised her in its intensity, pacing the corridor while Finch stood silent sentinel by the door. When Dr. Clark finally emerged, his expression was thoughtful rather than grim, and he addressed Eleanor directly, as though sensing she was the one who most needed to hear his verdict. "The injury to his Grace's spine is real, Miss Whitmore, and I will not pretend otherwise. But it is not, in my professional judgment, as complete as the physicians who first attended him believed. There is feeling in his legs where a full injury would leave none. There is response to certain stimuli that ought not to exist if the damage were as severe as he has been told." He shook his head slowly. "A year of stillness, of grief, of a mind convinced that recovery is impossible, can do nearly as much harm as the original injury itself. Muscles waste from disuse. Hope withers from neglect. I cannot promise His Grace will walk again, Miss Whitmore, but I can tell you that the door is not so firmly shut as he has believed." Eleanor's breath caught, hope and fear tangling together in her chest in equal measure. What would he need to do? "Work," Dr. Clark said simply. "Harder than he has ever worked at anything in his life, and with no guarantee of success, and likely a great deal of pain and frustration along the way. It would require someone at his side through all of it, someone patient enough not to give up on the days he wants to give up on himself, and stubborn enough to push him even when he resists." His eyes, sharp despite their kindness, moved over Eleanor with quiet assessment. "I suspect, Miss Whitmore, that such a person may already have found her way into this house." Eleanor did not answer him directly, though her heart beat hard against her ribs at the implication in his words. She only thanked him, and saw him to his carriage, and stood for a long while in the cool evening air after he had gone, looking back up at the tall gray face of Ashford Manor, at the single lit window of the study where she knew Adrian was waiting to hear what the physician had said. 3 weeks. It was such a small amount of time to undo a year of grief and stillness, to prove to a county full of skeptical neighbors and one calculating cousin that Adrian Ashford was neither broken nor unfit, but only a man who had, for too long, believed the worst about himself. It was such a small amount of time, and yet, standing there in the fading light, Eleanor found that for the first time since her father's death, she was not afraid of what lay ahead. She was, against all sense and caution, hopeful, and she suspected, climbing the front steps toward the study where Adrian waited for her, that hope was precisely the thing his cousin had never accounted for. She found him exactly where she expected, seated near the window rather than the fire tonight, watching the dusk settle over the gardens with an expression she could not quite read. He turned as she entered, and for once he did not wait for her to speak first. "Well, Miss Whitmore, it seems you have recruited an ally in Dr. Clark." "He believes there is hope, Your Grace." "He believes there is a possibility," Adrian corrected, though there was less bitterness in the words than she expected. A door not fully closed in his words. It is not the same as a promise. "No," Eleanor agreed, "but it is more than you had yesterday." He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from her face to his own still legs beneath the dark blanket, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped to something rower, something closer to the truth than his usual careful composure allowed. "I am afraid, Miss Whitmore, afraid to hope and afraid not to, and I do not know which fear frightens me more." "Then let us be afraid together," Eleanor said quietly, "and begin regardless. Lily has 3 weeks left of a childhood where she still has both the uncle who raised her and the home she has always known. I do not intend to let your cousin take either from her without a fight, and I do not think, in your heart, that you intend to let him either." Adrian's eyes met hers, storm gray and searching, and something passed between them that neither of them named aloud, though it settled into the room like a third presence, quiet and undeniable. "No," he said finally, softly. "I do not." Outside, the last light faded from the gardens, and somewhere in the house a clock struck the hour, counting down, unknowing, the first of the 21 days that would decide everything. The scream tore through the east wing before the sun had fully risen, and Alina was out of bed and running before she had even found her slippers. She reached the small exercise room they had cleared near Adrian's chambers to find him on the floor, having slipped from the parallel bars Dr. Clark had ordered built, his face white with pain, his hands braced against the boards as he tried, and failed, and tried again, to push himself upright. A young footman hovered uselessly nearby, clearly unsure whether to help or whether help would only wound the Duke's pride further. "Leave us," Alina said to the footman, who fled gratefully, and she crossed the room and knelt beside Adrian without hesitation, ignoring his sharp intake of breath, the flash of humiliation across his face at being seen like this. "Do not," he said through gritted teeth, "offer me pity, Miss Whitmore. I have had quite enough of it for one morning." "I am not offering pity. I am offering my shoulder, because it is closer to the ground than yours currently is, and because Dr. Clark told us this would be difficult before we ever began." She braced herself and helped him back onto the low bench beside the bars, and he allowed it, though his jaw remained tight with frustration. "How long were you attempting this before I heard you?" "Long enough to know it is impossible." 6 days is not long enough to know anything of the sort. It had been 6 days since Dr. Clark's examination, 6 days of a regimen the physician had prescribed with careful, unhurried patience. Exercises to wake the muscles that had gone still with disuse, attempts to bear weight for a few seconds at a time between the parallel bars, a routine that Adrian approached each morning with grim determination and abandoned each evening in exhausted, silent despair. Alina had made it her business to be present for as many of these sessions as her duties to Lily allowed, not because Dr. Clark required it, but because she had seen, on the second day, how much steadier his hands became when someone stood nearby who did not flinch at his struggle. "It has been 6 days of failure," Adrian said now, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of one hand, his voice tight with a frustration that Alina suspected was aimed as much at himself as at his uncooperative legs. 6 days, and I cannot manage even a full minute upright before my legs give way beneath me like a newborn colt's. The hearing is in 15 days, Miss Whitmore. 15 days, and I am no closer to walking into that assembly hall than I was the morning you found me weeping on this floor." "You were not weeping." "I was very nearly weeping, and we both know it." Alina allowed herself a small smile at that, and after a moment reluctantly, so did he, the tension in his shoulders easing by some small but noticeable degree. 15 days is not enough time to teach you to walk into that hall unassisted, Your Grace, and I think we both know it, whatever Dr. Clark's optimism might suggest. But it may be enough time to prove that you are trying, and that you are not the hollow, broken man your cousin has described to the magistrate. And how do you propose I prove that precisely? By being seen. Alina sat on the bench beside him, choosing her words carefully. You have hidden in this house for a year, Your Grace, and your cousin has used your absence as evidence of your incapacity. What if, instead of waiting 15 days to attempt a miracle in front of the magistrate, you allowed yourself to be seen now, in smaller ways, among people who might speak on your behalf when the hearing comes? Adrian's eyes narrowed slightly, considering. You mean the village? I mean the village, the church on Sunday perhaps, or the market on market day. Let the people of Millbrook see their Duke attending to his estate and his duties, chair or no chair, rather than hiding behind these walls where only your cousin's carefully chosen witnesses have anything to say about your condition. They will stare. They will stare regardless, Your Grace, whether you hide from them for another 15 days or face them tomorrow. At least if you face them, they will have something true to stare at, rather than whatever version of you your cousin has been describing over dinner tables across the county. He was silent for a long moment, and Alina watched the calculation move behind his eyes, old pride warring with new necessity. "You ask a great deal, Miss Whitmore." "I ask only what is required, Your Grace. I did not create the circumstances that require it." A reluctant huff of breath escaped him, not quite a laugh but close enough to it that Alina felt some of her own tension ease. "No," he admitted. "I suppose you did not." He looked down at his hands, still trembling faintly from the exertion of the morning's failed attempts, and when he spoke again his voice had dropped to something quieter, more honest than his usual guarded tone allowed. "I have not been to church since my brother's funeral. I do not know that I am ready to sit in that pew again, Miss Whitmore, surrounded by people who will remember exactly who sat beside me the last time I was there." Alina's chest tightened at the raw grief in his voice, and she resisted the urge to reach for his hand, uncertain whether such a gesture would comfort him or only remind him further of his vulnerability. "Then we will go together, Your Grace, Lily and I both, and you need not sit alone with your grief. You may sit with people who care what becomes of you, rather than people counting the ways you have failed to recover." His gaze lifted to hers, searching, something unguarded and grateful in his expression that made her breath catch. "You make it very difficult, Miss Whitmore, to remain as distant with you as propriety would suggest I ought." "I have been told I have that effect on people, Your Grace," she said lightly, though her own pulse had quickened at his words, and she rose quickly, needing the small distance the movement provided. "Now, Dr. Clark's instructions were quite specific about the number of repetitions you were meant to complete each morning, and I do not believe you have come close to finishing them." Adrian groaned, but there was no real protest in it, and he allowed her to help him back to the parallel bars, and for the next half hour they worked in a rhythm that had become, in 6 short days, oddly familiar. Her steady hands bracing him when his strength faltered, her voice counting the seconds he managed to remain upright, her patience unshaken even when his legs buckled for the 10th time in a row, and his frustration threatened to boil over into something sharper. It was during the 11th attempt, when his legs trembled violently and Alina moved instinctively to catch him, that their positions from that first rainy afternoon reversed themselves entirely. This time it was Alina who caught him as he fell forward, her arms coming up around his shoulders, his weight pressing against her for one suspended moment before she braced them both against the bars. His face was close to hers, close enough that she could see the fine lines of exhaustion at the corners of his eyes, close enough to feel his breath, unsteady from exertion, against her cheek. Neither of them moved for a long moment. "It seems," Adrian said quietly, his voice rougher than usual, "that we have found ourselves in remarkably similar positions to our first meeting, Miss Whitmore, though I believe the roles have somewhat reversed." "It would seem so, Your Grace." Alina did not step back, though every instinct of propriety told her she ought to. "Though I confess I find myself less embarrassed this time, and considerably more concerned that you have not injured yourself." "I have not." He straightened slowly with her help, his eyes never leaving hers. "Though I begin to suspect, Miss Whitmore, that catching me has become something of a habit for you." "I would not call it a habit, Your Grace. Merely a willingness to be present when you fall, so that you might find your feet again more easily the next time." Something shifted in his expression at that, something warmer and more open than the careful guardedness he usually wore, and for a moment Alina thought he might say something more, something neither of them was quite ready for. Instead he cleared his throat and looked away, back toward the parallel bars, though a faint color had risen in his cheeks that had nothing to do with the exertion of the morning. "We should continue," he said. "Dr. Clark's repetitions, as you say, remain unfinished." They worked through the remainder of the session in a silence that felt different than before, charged with something unspoken that neither of them seemed inclined to name, and when Alina finally left him to rest before the midday meal, she found her own hands were not quite steady, and her thoughts, try as she might to redirect them toward Lily's afternoon lessons or the ledgers Mrs. Bell had asked her to review, kept returning stubbornly to the memory of his breath against her cheek, and the warmth of his gaze when he had looked at her, unguarded, in that suspended moment before either of them remembered themselves. That evening, over a quiet supper with Lily, Alina mentioned, as casually as she could manage, the idea of attending church together on Sunday, and was startled by the sudden brightness that lit the girl's face. Truly, Uncle Adrian in the carriage at church with everyone watching. If he agrees to it, yes. Lily set down her spoon, her small face suddenly serious in a way that tugged at Alina's heart. He used to take me every Sunday before Papa died. We stopped after. I did not think he would ever want to go again. Perhaps he simply needed a reason to try, Alina said gently, and Lily's eyes, so like her uncle's, studied her with a knowing look far too old for her 7 years. I think you are his reason, Miss Whitmore, she said simply, and returned to her supper as though she had not just said something that set Alina's heart hammering uncomfortably against her ribs, something she could not deny, and did not, if she were entirely honest with herself in the privacy of her own thoughts, particularly want to. The church bells had not even finished ringing when Gerald Ashford appeared at the top of the churchyard steps, and Alina felt the morning's fragile triumph begin to crack beneath her feet. It had gone well at first, better than any of them had dared to hope. Adrian had allowed Finch to wheel him into the church ahead of the full congregation, avoiding the crowded aisle, and had taken his place in the family pew with Lily on one side and Alina on the other, his spine straight, his face composed, though Alina had felt the faint tremor in his hand when she had reached over briefly to steady it during the opening hymn. The congregation had stared, of course, as she had warned him they would, but the stares had softened as the service went on, whispers of sympathy rather than judgment passing among the pews, and by the final blessing Alina had seen more than one neighbor nod toward Adrian with something like respect. It was as they emerged into the bright morning air, Finch guiding the wheeled chair carefully down the ramp that had been built for the occasion, that Gerald appeared, and beside him, unmistakably, a man Alina did not recognize but whose bearing marked him immediately as a physician of some standing, the sort brought from a city rather than a country village. "Cousin," Gerald called out, his voice pitched just loud enough to carry across the churchyard, drawing the attention of the dispersing congregation. "How good to see you out among your neighbors at last. It has been so very long." "Gerald," Adrian's voice was controlled, but Alina, standing close enough to feel the tension radiating from him, heard the strain beneath it. "I was not aware you attended services in Millbrook." "I do not ordinarily, but Dr. Sutton here was passing through the county, and I thought it might interest him to observe your condition firsthand, given the questions before the magistrate." Gerald's smile was pleasant, poisonous. It seemed only fair that the court's own consulting physician have the chance to see you as you truly are, cousin, rather than relying on second-hand accounts. Alina felt her stomach drop. The unfamiliar physician stepped forward, his gaze moving over Adrian with clinical detachment, taking in the wheeled chair, the blanket over his legs, the effort visible in the set of his shoulders after the exertion of simply being transported down the ramp. "Your Grace," the physician said, with a small, formal bow that somehow managed to feel like an examination in itself. "I understand you have shown some slight improvement in recent days. Perhaps you might demonstrate for me now. A few steps, unassisted, would settle a great many questions before the hearing." The churchyard had gone quiet, the departing congregation slowing their steps, pretending not to watch while watching all the same. Alina saw the color drain from Adrian's face, saw his hands tighten on the arms of his chair, and understood in an instant precisely what Gerald had orchestrated. A public trap, sprung at the moment Adrian was most exposed, most likely to fail, and least able to refuse without appearing to confirm every doubt his cousin had planted. "This is neither the time nor the place for a medical examination," Alina said, stepping forward before she had fully decided to speak, drawing every eye in the churchyard toward herself instead. "His Grace has just come from worship, Dr. Sutton, not from a physician's surgery. I am certain you would not wish your professional judgment recorded under such irregular and public circumstances." The physician blinked, clearly unaccustomed to being addressed so directly by a governess, and glanced toward Gerald as though for guidance. Gerald's smile had tightened at the edges. "Miss Whitmore, is it? My cousin's new governess, appointing herself spokeswoman for his physical condition now, alongside his niece's education. How very accommodating you have made yourself, in such a short time. The insinuation in his tone was unmistakable, and Alina felt her cheeks heat, but she held his gaze without flinching. I speak only as any member of this household would, sir, in defense of a man being ambushed at church by a physician he has never engaged and did not agree to see. A murmur moved through the small crowd still lingering nearby, and Alina saw, with some satisfaction, that it was not entirely sympathetic to Gerald. Several of the older women exchanged disapproving glances at the spectacle he had made in the churchyard itself, of all places, and Alina sensed that whatever advantage Gerald had hoped to gain from this ambush was slipping rather than tightening in his grasp. "Dr. Sutton will examine me," Adrian said suddenly, his voice cutting through the tension, steadier than Alina had expected. Every eye turned to him, including hers, startled. "At the hearing before the magistrate, as was originally arranged and not a moment before. I will not be examined in a churchyard like a horse at market, Gerald, for your convenience or anyone else's." "Very sensible," Gerald said smoothly, though something flickered behind his eyes that suggested he had not entirely expected this composed refusal. "I only hope to spare the court some time, cousin, but of course we shall wait for the proper occasion." He inclined his head toward Alina with a look that made her skin crawl. "Miss Whitmore." "A pleasure as always." He departed with the physician in tow, and the churchyard slowly resumed its ordinary rhythm, neighbors offering murmured farewells to Adrian with a warmth that had not been there before Gerald's interruption, as though his cousin's transparent scheming had, in its own perverse way, won Adrian more sympathy than the church service alone could have achieved. It was not until they had returned to the manor, and Lily had been settled with Peggy for her afternoon rest, that Alina found Adrian alone in the garden, seated near the old stone fountain at its center, his face turned toward the low autumn sun with an expression she could not entirely read. "You should not have spoken to him as you did," he said, without turning as she approached. "In front of half the county. I could not stand by and watch him corner you like that." "I am aware." He finally looked at her, and there was something complicated in his gaze, gratitude tangled with a wariness that seemed aimed as much at himself as at her. "It was not entirely wise, Miss Whitmore. My cousin will make something of it. A governess so quick to defend her employer, so willing to place herself between him and a threat to his reputation. He will not miss the implication, and neither, I suspect, will the magistrate when Gerald finds some way to raise it at the hearing." Alina's chest tightened, understanding the danger he was pointing toward, the danger to her own position, her own reputation, should Gerald choose to twist her defense of Adrian into something improper. "Would you prefer I had remained silent?" "No," Adrian said quietly immediately. "I would not have preferred that at all. I only fear what it may cost you to have defended me so publicly." "I did not do it for a cost and benefit, Your Grace. I did it because it was right, and because I could not bear to watch him humiliate you for sport." Something shifted in his expression at that, softening, the wariness giving way to something warmer, and he gestured to the stone bench beside the fountain. Alina sat, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the only sound the gentle trickle of water over old stone and the distant call of birds settling into the hedges as the afternoon light began to lengthen. "My brother used to sit here," Adrian said finally, his voice quiet, almost meditative. "Every Sunday after church before the accident, we would sit here together, and he would tease me about whichever young woman my grandmother had most recently attempted to arrange a match with, and I would tease him about Lily's mother, and we would sit until the light failed and Finch came to tell us supper was ready." He paused, his jaw tightening briefly against some old grief. "I have not sat here since the funeral. I did not think I could bear it. And now I find I can bear a great many things I did not think possible, Miss Whitmore, and I confess I am not entirely certain how to account for the change." He turned to look at her fully then, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. "I have spent a year convinced that the man I was before the accident was simply gone, buried alongside my brother, and that whatever remained of me was only a hollow shell, going through the motions of managing an estate and raising a child I did not know how to comfort. And then you fell into my arms on the front steps of my own house, soaked through and mortified, and something in me that I thought had died along with my legs began, very slowly, to wake again. Alina's heart was hammering now, so loudly she was certain he must hear it. "Your Grace." "Adrian," he said softly, "if we are to speak so plainly of things, I think you might at least call me by my name." "Adrian," she repeated, and the sound of it in her own voice felt like crossing some threshold she could not uncross. "I do not know what to say to what you have just told me." "You need not say anything." He reached out slowly, as though giving her every opportunity to withdraw, and covered her hand with his own where it rested on the stone bench between them. "I only wished you to know it, whatever comes of the hearing, whatever my cousin manages to twist from a governess who dared to defend her employer in a churchyard. I wished you to know that you have done more to restore me in these 2 short weeks than a year of physicians and grief and solitude ever managed on their own." The garden had gone very still around them, the light golden and low, and Alina found she could not look away from him, from the raw sincerity in his storm-colored eyes, from the warmth of his hand over hers. In the distance, thunder rolled low over the hills, the first sign of a storm gathering somewhere beyond the horizon, but neither of them moved to seek shelter, caught instead in a moment that felt too fragile, too precious, to abandon for the sake of dry clothes. "I have grown to care for you a great deal, Adrian," Alina said quietly, the confession trembling on her tongue but no less true for the fear of speaking it aloud. "More than is wise, I think, for a governess and a duke, and more than your cousin would ever allow me to admit without turning it into a weapon against you." "Then let him try," Adrian said, his thumb tracing a slow, gentle line across her knuckles. "Let him say whatever he wishes at the hearing, Miss Whitmore. I find, sitting here with you, that I am no longer quite so afraid of what he might say, nor of what it might cost me to have found something worth fighting for again." The first drops of rain began to fall as he spoke, scattered and light at first, and Alina laughed softly, the sound catching somewhere between joy and disbelief at the echo of that very first rainy afternoon when she had fallen, quite literally, into his life. "It seems we are destined to meet in storms, Your Grace." "Adrian," he corrected again, though he was smiling now, a real smile, unguarded and warm, the kind she suspected he had not worn since long before his brother's death. "And if it is our fate to meet in storms, Miss Whitmore, I find myself rather grateful for the weather." The rain came harder then, sudden and full, and Alina rose to help him back toward the house, both of them laughing now despite the chill soaking through their Sunday clothes, and it was not until they had reached the shelter of the covered terrace, breathless and dripping, that Alina realized how completely, how irrevocably everything between them had changed in that single golden hour beside the fountain, storm gathering overhead, hearing looming ahead, and neither of them, for the first time in longer than either could remember, quite so afraid of what came next. A floorboard creaked in the corridor outside, and Adrian froze with both hands white-knuckled on the parallel bars, one bare foot hovering above the floor, caught between the safety of his chair and the terrifying, thrilling possibility of a single unassisted step. It was well past midnight. He had waited until the house was fully asleep, until even Finch's careful footsteps had faded toward the servants' quarters, before wheeling himself quietly to the exercise room, driven by an urgency he could not entirely explain even to himself, some restless need to test, alone and unwitnessed, whether the progress of the past 2 weeks was real or only a kindness Alina and Dr. Clark had allowed him to believe in. The creak came again, closer this time, and Adrian's heart lurched with something that felt uncomfortably close to the shame he had carried through every failed attempt of the past fortnight. He did not want to be found like this, half upright and trembling, caught between falling and standing, by some servant who would carry the tale to the kitchens by morning. The door opened softly, and it was not a servant at all but Alina, her hair loose over her shoulders, a shawl clutched around a plain white nightgown, her candle throwing long shadows across the walls. "I heard movement," she said quietly, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. I did not expect to find you here at this hour. I could not sleep. Adrian's arms were trembling now, the strain of holding himself upright without assistance beginning to tell, but something stubborn in him refused to lower himself back into the chair while she watched, refused to concede defeat before he had even properly attempted the thing he had come here to attempt. I thought I might try alone, without an audience to witness the failure if it came. And has it come? Not yet. His voice was tight with effort. Though I confess, I am not entirely certain how much longer I can remain upright to find out. Alina set her candle on the table and crossed the room without hesitation, coming to stand just beyond the parallel bars, close enough to catch him should his legs finally give way, far enough to leave him the dignity of attempting this on his own terms. Then do not waste your strength standing still, Your Grace. Move. One step. That is all Dr. Clark asked of you today, and you have already exceeded his instructions by attempting it at midnight instead of waiting for morning. Bossy, even at this hour. Especially at this hour when there is no one else awake to scold you for your recklessness. But there was warmth in her voice, not scolding at all, and it steadied something in his chest even as his legs continued to tremble beneath him. Try, Adrian, I am here, I will not let you fall. He believed her. That was the strange, unexpected thing, the thing that had crept up on him slowly over the past 2 weeks, until he could no longer quite remember what it had felt like not to believe it. He trusted this woman, utterly and without reservation, in a way he had trusted almost no one since his brother's death, and something in that trust loosened the fear enough that he found himself shifting his weight forward, testing the strength of the leg that had, for the first time in days, begun to answer his commands with something more than a useless, trembling weakness. The step, when it came, was small and unsteady and nearly disastrous, his balance tipping dangerously before he caught himself against the bar, but it was, unmistakably, a step. His own foot, moving forward under his own command, bearing his own weight for the length of a single, trembling stride. Alina gasped, a small, involuntary sound of pure joy, and Adrian found himself laughing, breathless and disbelieving, tears he had not expected pricking at the corners of his eyes. I did it, he said, half to himself, half to her. Alina, I did it. You did. She was smiling so widely it transformed her whole face, candlelight catching the brightness in her eyes. One step, Adrian. It is only one step, but it is a beginning, and beginnings are the hardest part. He wanted, in that moment, more than he had wanted anything in the long gray year since his brother's death, to cross the small distance between them and pull her into his arms, to share this triumph with her not as governess and duke, but simply as two people who had fought their way together, towards something that had seemed impossible only a fortnight before. His legs, however, had other plans, buckling suddenly beneath the strain of the effort, and he pitched forward without warning, straight into Alina's waiting arms for the second time in a fortnight, though this time there was no rain, no mortification, only the warm circle of her embrace catching him as he laughed against her shoulder, giddy and exhausted and more alive than he had felt in over a year. It seems, he murmured, his face still buried against the curve of her neck, that catching me truly has become a habit for you, Miss Whitmore. It seems, she answered, her arms tightening around him, that I do not mind it in the slightest, Your Grace. He drew back just enough to look at her, their faces close in the candle-lit dark, her breath warm against his cheek, and the air between them seemed to still entirely, charged with a tension neither of them made any move to break. Slowly, giving her every chance to step away, he lifted one hand to trace the line of her jaw, and when she did not pull back, when instead her eyes fluttered closed and she leaned, ever so slightly, into his touch, he closed the last small distance between them and kissed her. It was soft at first, careful, questioning, and then Alina's hand came up to rest against his chest, not pushing him away but drawing him closer, and the kiss deepened into something neither of them had words for, something that tasted of relief and hope and the particular, fierce tenderness of two people who had each expected to spend the remainder of their lives alone with their grief, and had found, instead, an unexpected refuge in one another. When they finally parted, both breathless, Adrian rested his forehead against hers, his hand still cradling her jaw. "I have wanted to do that," he admitted quietly, "since the night you told me fear and weakness are not the same thing, and I realized I had never met anyone quite so unafraid to say difficult things plainly to my face." "I have wanted it rather longer than that," Elinor confessed, a soft laugh escaping her despite the seriousness of her tone. "Though I told myself, quite firmly, that a governess had no business wanting such things from her employer. I am glad you did not listen to yourself." "So am I," she drew back, though her hand remained pressed against his chest, as though reluctant to break the contact entirely. "Though I confess I do not know what we are meant to do with this, Adrian. Your cousin is already circling for any weapon he might use against you at the hearing. If it were ever to become known that the governess and the Duke—" "It will not become known," Adrian said firmly, though a shadow had crossed his expression at the reminder of Gerald and the hearing still looming ahead. "Not until the hearing is decided and Lily's guardianship secured, and my cousin has no further leverage to twist against either of us. I will not risk your reputation, Elinor, nor Lily's future for the sake of my own happiness, however dearly I have come to want it." Elinor nodded slowly, understanding the wisdom in his caution even as something in her chest ached at the necessity of it. "Then we wait," she said, quietly and carefully, "until the hearing is behind us." "We wait," Adrian agreed, "though I confess the waiting will be considerably harder now than it was before tonight." He helped her guide him back into his chair then, his legs trembling with a fatigue that felt, for the first time in a year, like the good and honest exhaustion of real effort rather than the hollow ache of futility. And as Elinor wheeled him back toward his chambers through the sleeping house, candle flickering between them, he found himself turning the events of the evening over and over in his mind. The single triumphant step, the warmth of her arms catching him, the impossible sweetness of her mouth against his, and beneath all of it, a fragile new hope that perhaps, against every fear that had governed the past year of his life, he might yet find his way back to something whole. They parted at the door to his chambers with a lingering look that promised more than either of them could safely speak aloud in the quiet corridor, and Elinor made her way back to her own small room on the third floor with her heart racing and her lips still warm from his kiss, utterly unable, despite her exhaustion, to find any sleep at all. She did not know, lying awake and smiling at her own ceiling in the dark, that below her window in the shrubbery along the garden wall, a figure had lingered rather longer than was proper that evening, drawn by curiosity about lights burning so late in the exercise room, and had witnessed, through the gap in the curtains Adrian had forgotten to fully close, considerably more of the scene between the Duke and his governess than either of them would have wished any soul in the county to see. The figure slipped away into the darkness before the household stirred, unnoticed, carrying with him the one piece of leverage Gerald Ashford had been searching for since the very morning Elinor Whitmore had arrived, soaked through and stumbling into his cousin's waiting arms. "You will dismiss her by morning, or I will see that every soul in this county knows precisely what passes between you and your niece's governess after the household has gone to sleep." Gerald's voice was low and cold, stripped of all pretense of courtesy, and Adrian felt the blood drain from his face as his cousin stood in the doorway of the study, arms folded, a smile of terrible satisfaction curling at the edges of his mouth. Elinor, seated across the desk reviewing the household accounts with Adrian, went very still beside him. "I do not know what you imagine you have seen, Gerald," Adrian said, his voice carefully controlled despite the panic clawing at his chest. "But I would advise you to consider very carefully before you make accusations you cannot prove. I need not prove anything to the servants who will whisper it, nor to the neighbors who will believe whatever scandal reaches them fastest, true or otherwise." Gerald stepped further into the room, his gaze sliding to Elinor with open contempt. A duke and his governess, alone at midnight in an unlit room, locked in an embrace that left little to the imagination. "I have a witness, cousin, and I assure you he was quite thorough in his account." Elinor's face had gone pale, but her spine remained straight, her chin lifted in the same unbroken defiance Adrian had come to love in the fortnight since she had fallen so unexpectedly into his life. "Whatever you believe you have learned, sir, it changes nothing about His Grace's fitness to raise his niece, nor his competence to manage this estate." "It changes everything, Miss Whitmore, when the magistrate hears that the man petitioning to retain guardianship of an innocent child has been carrying on with the very woman entrusted to educate her." Gerald's smile widened, cruel and triumphant. "A duke so lost to grief and desperation that he has taken up with the household staff. It paints rather a different picture than the one you have both worked so hard to construct these past weeks, does it not?" "Get out," Adrian said, his voice low and dangerous, the calm control finally cracking to reveal the fury beneath it. "Get out of my house, Gerald, before I say something we will both regret." "I will leave gladly, cousin, once we have reached an understanding." Gerald's tone remained maddeningly composed, a man entirely certain of his own advantage. "Dismiss Miss Whitmore. Send her from this house before the hearing, quietly, with whatever severance you feel necessary to salve your conscience, and I will see that my witness forgets what he believes he observed. Refuse, and I promise you the entire county will hear of it before the week is out, and the magistrate along with them." The silence that followed was thick with tension, and Alina felt the weight of the choice settling over the room like a physical presence. She could see the anguish in Adrian's face, torn between the fierce protectiveness he had shown her from the moment his cousin appeared, and the desperate need to protect Lily's future, a future that hung now on the outcome of a hearing that was only a week away. "Adrian," she said quietly before he could speak, "perhaps we should discuss this privately." "There is nothing to discuss," Adrian said, his eyes never leaving his cousin's face. "I will not dismiss Miss Whitmore, Gerald, whatever tale your witness carries to the village. If you wish to make it public, then make it public, and let the magistrate weigh a moment of private affection against a year of careful, deliberate cruelty on your own part, orchestrated at every turn to strip a grieving child of the only family she has left." Gerald's composure flickered, just slightly, clearly not having anticipated such an immediate and total refusal. "You would risk Lily's future, cousin, for the sake of a governess you have known scarcely a fortnight." "I would risk a great deal for the sake of a woman who has shown me more honesty and courage in a fortnight than you have shown this family in a decade of scheming," Adrian said, and Alina's heart swelled painfully at the fierce conviction in his voice, even as fear for what it might cost them both twisted tight in her chest. "But I do not believe, in the end, that it will come to such a choice. Because I do not believe the magistrate is quite so easily led as you imagine, Gerald, and I do not believe the good people of this county, who watch me sit in that church pew 2 Sundays past, will so readily abandon their judgment of my character on the word of an unnamed witness peering through a gap in my curtains." For a long moment, Gerald simply stared at his cousin, some calculation shifting visibly behind his eyes, and then, without another word, he turned on his heel and strode from the study, his footsteps echoing sharp and furious down the corridor until the front door slammed shut behind him. Alina exhaled a breath she had not realized she was holding, her hands trembling in her lap. "Adrian, if this becomes known, it will not only harm you. It will destroy any chance I have of finding a respectable position again, anywhere in England." "I know." Adrian reached across the desk and took her hand, his grip firm and steady despite the storm of emotion still visible in his face. "I would not have you sacrifice your reputation for my sake, Alina, and if there were any way to undo what has happened, to protect you from what Gerald threatens, I would do it without hesitation. But you will not dismiss me." "I could not," he said simply, "even if I believed it would solve everything, because I find I have grown entirely unwilling to imagine this house, or this coming week, or any week beyond it without you in it." The words settled over her like warmth after a long, cold winter, and despite the fear still coiled tight in her chest, Alina found herself smiling, however faintly. "Then we face the hearing together, Gerald's witness and all, and we hope the magistrate proves a more reasonable man than your cousin has counted on." "We do," Adrian agreed. "Though I think, perhaps, We ought to prepare rather more carefully than we have thus far, in case Gerald makes good on his threat before the week is out. Word of Gerald's confrontation reached the servants' hall by supper, as such things inevitably did in a house full of watchful eyes and listening ears, and Alina found herself the subject of careful, sympathetic glances from Mrs. Bell and Peggy alike, though neither woman said a word of judgment aloud. It was Finch, unexpectedly, who sought her out that evening in the quiet of the library, his usually impassive face creased with something like concern. "Miss Whitmore, I wish to say, whatever gossip reaches this house or the village beyond it, that I have served this family for 20 years, and I have not seen his grace so restored to himself since long before the accident. Whatever the cost to your reputation, I do not believe it has been spent in vain." "Thank you, Finch, that means a great deal coming from you. I only hope the magistrate proves as clear-sighted as the rest of this household has become in recognizing what truly matters in this affair." He inclined his head and made to leave, then paused at the door. "Master Gerald's witness, Miss Whitmore, I have made certain inquiries among the staff. I believe I know who it was, and I do not believe his account, when properly examined, will hold quite the weight Master Gerald imagines." Alina's breath caught with sudden hope. "Who was it, Finch?" "A stable hand, dismissed from this household some months past for drunkenness and theft, who has been seen twice this fortnight in the company of Master Gerald's own valet in the village tavern." Finch's expression remained carefully neutral, but there was a glint of quiet satisfaction in his eyes. "A man with such a history makes for a rather unreliable witness, I should think, particularly one so conveniently employed by the very cousin who stands to benefit from his testimony." Hope, cautious and fragile, began to unfurl in Alina's chest, as she carried this information to Adrian that evening, finding him once again in the exercise room, working through Dr. Clark's prescribed repetitions with a grim determination that had only sharpened since Gerald's threat. "A dismissed stable hand," Adrian repeated, when she had relayed Finch's discovery, his hands pausing on the parallel bars. "Paid, I would wager everything I own, by my cousin himself, to fabricate or exaggerate whatever he claims to have witnessed. It may not prevent the rumor from spreading, but it may well undermine its credibility before the magistrate, should Gerald be foolish enough to introduce it as evidence." Alina allowed herself a small, fierce smile. "Your cousin has made a grave error, Adrian, believing that a house full of loyal servants would simply stand aside and watch him destroy you. They are loyal to you as much as to me, I think, after these past weeks." Adrian's gaze softened as it settled on her, warm despite the exhaustion etched into his face from the evening's exercises. "You have done more for this household in a fortnight than I managed to do for it in the entire year since my brother's death, Alina. I do not know how I will ever repay such a debt." "You need not repay anything, Adrian. Only stand when the day comes, and let the magistrate see the man I have come to know these past weeks, rather than the broken shadow your cousin has spent a year describing to anyone who would listen." He reached for her hand, and she came to him without hesitation, and for a long moment they simply held one another in the quiet of the exercise room, the week's dangers and threats momentarily forgotten in the fragile comfort of each other's presence, while outside the window the last week before the hearing began, unstoppable, to count itself down. The assembly hall was already full when Finch wheeled Adrian through the side entrance, every bench crowded with neighbors and gossips and the merely curious, and Alina felt the weight of 100 watching eyes settle over her the moment she stepped through the door at Adrian's side. The magistrate, a thin-faced man named Justice Pemberton with sharp eyes that missed nothing, sat behind a raised table at the front of the hall, papers arranged before him with meticulous precision. Gerald was already seated at the front, immaculate in a dark blue coat, his expression composed into an appearance of grave, reluctant concern, as though the entire proceeding pained him deeply, and he undertook it only from the most selfless of motives. Beside him sat the physician from the churchyard, and behind them both, Alina spotted with a jolt of recognition, the dismissed stable hand Finch had identified, looking distinctly uncomfortable in an ill-fitting coat clearly bought for the occasion. Lily sat pressed close against Aliner's side in the front row, her small hand gripping Aliner's with a strength that belied her age, her eyes fixed on her uncle with an anxiety that made Aliner's chest ache. Mrs. Bell and Peggy occupied the row behind them, along with several of the household staff who had insisted on attending despite Adrian's protests that their presence was not required. "Let us begin," Justice Pemberton said, his voice carrying easily through the crowded hall. "This hearing has been called to determine the continued fitness of Adrian Ashford, Duke of Ashford, to serve as guardian to his niece, Lily Ashford, and to manage the estate and title in her interest until her majority. Mr. Gerald Ashford, as petitioner, you may present your case." Gerald rose with practiced gravity, addressing the magistrate with the smooth, reasonable tone of a man who believed himself entirely in the right. "Your worship, I bring this petition with the heaviest of hearts, out of concern for my young cousin's welfare rather than any personal ambition. My cousin Adrian has not been seen in society for over a year following the tragic accident that claimed my uncle's life and left him unable to walk. He has withdrawn entirely from his duties, from public life, from the ordinary business of managing an estate that will one day belong to Lily herself. I ask only that the court consider whether a man in such diminished circumstances can truly provide the stable, capable guardianship a young girl deserves." He called his witnesses one by one, neighbors who had not seen Adrian in over a year, and testified to it with evident discomfort at being asked. The city physician, Dr. Sutton, who spoke in careful, hedged terms about the general severity of spinal injuries and the unlikelihood of significant recovery a year after such trauma. And finally, with a flourish that made Aliner's stomach tighten with dread, the dismissed stable hand, who stood before the magistrate and recounted, in halting and clearly rehearsed language, what he claimed to have witnessed through the exercise room window on the night of Adrian's first step. A ripple of scandalized murmuring moved through the hall as the man spoke, and Aliner felt her cheeks burn, felt Lily's hand tighten further around her own, felt Adrian go rigid beside her with barely contained fury. But when Justice Pemberton turned to question the witness directly, his sharp eyes narrowing with evident skepticism, Aliner allowed herself a small, cautious breath of hope. "You say you were dismissed from His Grace's employ some months prior to this alleged incident," the magistrate said, consulting his notes. "For theft and drunkenness, I understand, and you have been seen since in the company of the petitioner's own valet on more than one occasion at a public house in Millbrook." The stable hand shifted uncomfortably, his rehearsed confidence faltering. "I don't know nothing about that, your worship. I only saw what I saw." "And what you saw, conveniently, has proven of considerable use to the very cousin who dismissed you, and who now appears to have compensated you for your testimony here today." Pemberton's tone had turned distinctly cold. "I will weigh this testimony accordingly, Mr. Ashford, and I would advise you, in future petitions before this court, against relying on witnesses so easily discredited." Gerald's composure cracked, just slightly, a flush of anger rising in his face before he smoothed it away. But Aliner saw Adrian's shoulders ease fractionally beside her, and she reached for his hand beneath the cover of her skirts, offering what quiet reassurance she could. "Your Grace," the magistrate said, turning his attention finally to Adrian, "you may respond to the petition and to whatever testimony you believe relevant to your fitness as guardian." Adrian was quiet for a long moment, and Aliner felt her heart pound with fear for what he was about to attempt. The plan they had discussed and rehearsed and worried over through every night of the past week, uncertain even now whether it would prove triumph or humiliation before this crowded hall. "Your worship," Adrian said, his voice steady despite the tension visible in every line of his body, "I will not pretend the past year has been easy, nor that I emerged from my brother's death and my own injury unchanged. I withdrew from society because I believed myself broken beyond repair, and I did not wish the county to witness what I imagined was a permanent and pitiable decline. I was wrong to withdraw so completely, and wrong to let a year pass without proving, to myself as much as to anyone else, that a man may be wounded without being destroyed. He paused, and Alina saw Finch step forward at some unspoken signal, positioning himself close at hand though not quite touching the wheeled chair. I have spent the past 3 weeks working, harder than I have worked at anything in my life, to prove that to myself, Adrian continued. I do not know if what I am about to attempt will succeed entirely, your worship, and I do not offer it as proof that my injury is fully healed, for it is not, and may never be. But I offer it as proof that I have not surrendered to it, and that a man who has not surrendered is not, I would submit, unfit to raise a child who needs, more than anything, an example of exactly that kind of courage. He gripped the arms of his chair, and slowly, with visible effort, with the entire hall holding its breath in absolute silence, Adrian Ashford pushed himself upright. His legs trembled violently, and for one terrible moment Alina feared he would fall, feared the entire carefully constructed moment would collapse into humiliation before the very audience it was meant to convince. But he held, swaying, one hand braced against the back of his chair, and then, with agonizing slowness, he took a single step forward, unassisted, into the open space before the magistrate's table. The silence in the hall was absolute. Lily had risen halfway from her seat, both hands pressed to her mouth, tears streaming freely down her small face. Mrs. Bell had gone pale, gripping Peggy's arm, and Alina, watching the man she loved stand and walk before a hall full of witnesses who had come expecting to see him confirmed as broken, felt her own eyes fill with tears she made no effort to hide. Adrian took a second step, and a third, his breathing ragged with the effort, sweat beating at his temple, and then, with his legs finally beginning to buckle beneath the strain, he reached the front of the magistrate's table and steadied himself against it, upright, trembling, and entirely, unmistakably standing on his own 2 feet before the whole of the assembled county. I am not the man I was before the accident, your worship, Adrian said, breathless but resolute, and I do not know if I will ever fully be again. But I am not the man my cousin has described to you either, a hollow, incapable shadow unfit to raise a child or manage an estate. I am a man who fell, and who has spent every day since fighting to rise again, and I would submit that a girl who has already lost her father could ask for no better example of what it means to endure. The hall erupted into a murmur of astonishment, and Alina was gratified to hear. Unmistakable admiration, and Justice Pemberton himself seemed momentarily at a loss for words, studying Adrian with an expression that had shifted entirely from skeptical formality to something like genuine respect. Your Grace, the magistrate said finally, you have made your case rather more eloquently than words alone could manage. I have heard sufficient testimony today to satisfy this court that Mr. Gerald Ashford's petition is without adequate merit, and appears, on the evidence presented, to have been motivated rather more by personal ambition than by genuine concern for the welfare of Miss Lily Ashford. He turned a hard look toward Gerald, whose face had gone ashen with the realization of his defeat. This petition is dismissed. Guardianship of Lily Ashford and management of the Ashford estate remains with His Grace the Duke of Ashford, and I would advise Mr. Gerald Ashford against bringing further petitions of this nature before my court without considerably stronger foundation than he has offered today. The hall broke into a swell of murmured conversation, and Alina barely registered Lily flying past her to throw her small arms around her uncle's waist, nearly toppling him back into his waiting chair, both of them laughing and crying at once amid the astonished, admiring gaze of the entire county. Gerald rose stiffly and departed without a word, his careful composure entirely abandoned, his scheme unraveled in the space of a single morning, and Alina watched him go with a fierce satisfaction that she made no effort to disguise. It was only later, once the crowd had thinned, and well-wishers had finally stopped pressing forward to offer their congratulations, that Adrian found Alina waiting near the hall's entrance. Lily finally settled into Mrs. Bell's care for the carriage ride home. You did it, Alina said softly, unable to keep the tremor of emotion from her voice. Adrian, you truly did it. We did it, he corrected, reaching for her hand without any pretense of concealment now, heedless of the lingering onlookers who watched with open curiosity. I could not have taken a single step of this journey without you, Eleanor, not the first one in the rain on my doorstep, nor the ones I took today before that magistrate. I do not intend to take any further steps without you beside me, if you will have me. Eleanor's breath caught, understanding the weight of what he was truly asking beneath the words. Adrian, your cousin's scheme may be defeated, but the scandal of what he threatened has not entirely vanished. If we let it come, Adrian said firmly, echoing the same fierce conviction he had shown his cousin in the study a week before. I have spent a year hiding from what people might think of me, Eleanor, and I have learned, this past month, precisely what that cost me. I will not spend another moment hiding from the truth of what I feel for you, whatever gossip it invites. He raised her hand to his lips, right there in the emptying hall, before the last lingering witnesses of Millbrook. Marry me, Eleanor Whitmore, not because propriety demands it after whatever scandal my cousin threatens, but because I cannot imagine a single day of the rest of my life that I do not wish to spend beside you. Eleanor felt tears spill freely down her cheeks now, joy overwhelming every careful caution she had maintained through the long, uncertain weeks since her fall into his arms. Yes, she said, laughing through her tears. Yes, Adrian, of course, yes. He drew her down and kissed her then, in the middle of the emptying assembly hall, before whatever remained of Millbrook's watchful eyes, and Eleanor found she did not care in the slightest who saw, caring only for the warmth of his mouth against hers, and the extraordinary, impossible joy of a story that had begun with a fall in the rain, and had led, against every expectation, to exactly this. The chapel doors burst open just as the vicar reached the final words of the ceremony, and Gerald Ashford strode down the aisle waving a folded document above his head, his voice ringing out over the startled gasps of the assembled guests. Stop this ceremony at once. I have here a letter from my late uncle, discovered only yesterday among his private papers, which casts serious doubt on the legitimacy of Adrian's claim to the title itself. Eleanor felt Adrian's hand tighten around her own where they stood before the altar, though his face remained remarkably composed, only a slight tightening at the corner of his jaw betraying his frustration at this final, desperate interruption. Lily, standing beside Mrs. Bell in the front pew and addressed the color of new spring leaves, let out a small, indignant huff at the sight of her great-uncle's return. Gerald, Adrian said evenly, turning to face his cousin as murmurs rippled through the chapel, you had your hearing before the magistrate. You lost it fairly before a full accounting of evidence. What precisely do you imagine this new theatrical display will accomplish? This letter, Gerald said, brandishing the paper with the same triumphant confidence he had worn before the churchyard ambush weeks earlier, though there was a brittleness beneath it now that suggested even he understood how thin his ground had become, suggests that my uncle intended before his death to alter the succession in my favor, believing you unfit to manage the estate even before your accident. I have witnesses prepared to testify to its authenticity. Dr. Clark, seated near the front of the chapel among the invited guests, rose without hesitation. I attended your uncle in his final illness, Mr. Ashford, and kept careful record of his correspondence during that period at his own request, precisely because he feared some such attempt might be made after his death to unsettle the succession. I would be very interested to examine this letter myself, and to compare its hand against the considerable collection of your uncle's genuine correspondence still held at the manor. Gerald's confidence flickered visibly, and Finch, standing near the chapel door in his best coat, stepped forward with the quiet authority of a man who had spent 20 years managing precisely this sort of household crisis. If I may, Your Grace. I took the liberty, some days past, of having the estate's solicitor review every document pertaining to the succession, anticipating that Master Gerald might attempt some further challenge. The solicitor's findings are quite thorough, and quite damning to any claim that might rest on a conveniently discovered letter with no prior record of its existence. The chapel had fallen into a tense, expectant hush, and Alina watched Gerald's composure crumble by degrees as Dr. Clark crossed the aisle and took the letter from his unresisting hand, studying it with a practiced eye before shaking his head slowly. "This is not your uncle's hand, Mr. Ashford. The loop of the letters is wrong, and your uncle, in his final months, suffered a tremor in his writing hand from illness that this document does not show at all. I would stake my professional reputation on the fact that this was written by someone considerably younger and steadier of hand than my late patient, and likely within the past fortnight rather than the years-old document you claim it to be." A murmur of scandalized understanding moved through the assembled guests, and Gerald, finally and completely undone, looked from face to face around the chapel and found nothing but cold judgment returned to him. Even the neighbors who had once whispered sympathetically about his concern for his cousin's welfare now regarded him with open disdain. The pattern of his year-long campaign against Adrian finally, fully visible for what it had always been. "This is not finished," Gerald said, though the words carried none of their earlier menace, brittle and hollow in the face of his obvious defeat. "It is finished, Gerald," Adrian said quietly, and there was no triumph in his voice, only a tired, final sort of pity. "It has been finished since the moment you chose ambition over family, and I think, if you search your own conscience honestly, you have known that for rather longer than you have been willing to admit. Go home. Do not return to this house again, unless it is with a genuine wish to be part of this family, rather than to dismantle it." Gerald stood frozen for a long moment, and then, without another word, he turned and walked from the chapel, his footsteps echoing hollow against the stone floor until the doors swung shut behind him. And this time, everyone in the chapel understood without needing to be told that he would not return. The vicar, recovering himself with admirable speed, cleared his throat and glanced uncertainly between the bride and groom. "Shall we, continue, your grace?" Adrian turned back to Alina, and despite the strange and unwelcome interruption, despite the lingering tension still humming through the chapel, she found herself laughing softly at the sheer absurdity of it, and saw her own disbelieving amusement mirrored in his eyes. "I did warn you, Miss Whitmore," he murmured, low enough for only her to hear, "that my family does not do things quietly. I begin to suspect I would not know what to do with a quiet family at this point," she whispered back, and he laughed then too, warm and unguarded, and the vicar, sensing the moment had been sufficiently restored to its proper solemnity, cleared his throat once more and completed the ceremony to a chapel full of relieved and delighted applause. They walked from the chapel together as husband and wife, Adrian's steps slower and more careful than an ordinary man's, aided now by a simple cane rather than the wheeled chair that had once seemed his permanent fate, but steady and entirely his own, and Alina thought, watching him move beside her into the bright afternoon sunlight, that she had never seen anyone look so thoroughly, unmistakably alive. The months that followed brought their own small challenges, as all lives do, but none so dire as the ones they had already weathered together. Adrian's recovery continued its slow, uneven progress under Dr. Clark's patient guidance, some days bringing new strength and others bringing frustrating setbacks. But he faced each of them now with the steady, hard-won knowledge that a setback was not the same as defeat, a lesson Alina suspected would serve him for the whole of his life, beyond the particular circumstance that had first taught it to him. Lily flourished under the settled happiness of the household, her wariness softening by degrees into the ordinary, unguarded joy of a child, who had finally learned that the people around her intended to stay. She grew especially close to Alina, no longer simply as a governess but as something nearer to a mother, and on quiet evenings the three of them could often be found together in the library, Adrian reading aloud from whatever novel had currently captured Lily's interest, Alina curled beside him with her head against his shoulder, the fire crackling low and warm against the autumn chill outside. Gerald was never seen at Ashford Manor again, though word reached them eventually, through the ordinary channels of county gossip, that he had removed himself to London, his reputation too thoroughly damaged in the county to sustain the social ambitions that had driven so much of his scheming in the first place. Elinor found, to her own quiet surprise, that she felt no particular satisfaction in his downfall, only a settled relief that the shadow he had cast over the household for so long had finally, fully lifted. On the anniversary of that first rainy afternoon, a year to the day since Elinor had stumbled up the front steps of Ashford Manor and fallen, quite literally, into the life she had never imagined for herself, Adrian led her out to the same spot at the top of the stairs, leaning on his cane, a small, private smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "Do you remember," he said, "how thoroughly mortified you were that first day?" "I remember thinking I had ruined my only chance at respectable employment within the first 5 minutes of arriving," Elinor said, laughing at the memory now, though it had felt like the end of the world at the time. "I did not imagine, standing here soaked through and horrified, that I would one day be standing here again as your wife." "Nor did I imagine," Adrian said, drawing her close against his side, "that the woman who fell into my arms that afternoon would be the one to teach me how to stand again, in every sense that mattered." He kissed the top of her head, gentle and unhurried, the two of them silhouetted against the same gray stone doorway where it had all begun. "I have thought often about what might have happened if you had not slipped on that step, Elinor. If the carriage had come for you at the crossroads as it was meant to, and you had arrived dry and composed and entirely unremarkable to a man who had already given up on the notion of ever being truly seen again." "I prefer to think," Elinor said softly, tilting her face up to his, "that some things find their way to happening regardless, storm or no storm, carriage or no carriage. I think we were always going to find each other, Adrian, one way or another." "Perhaps," he agreed, and kissed her again, unhurried and certain, the autumn light golden around them, the manor standing solid and warm at their backs. And inside, somewhere in the depths of the house, they could hear Lily's laughter ringing bright and unguarded through the halls, the sound of a family finally, fully healed, and a story that had begun with a fall ending, at last, exactly where it was always meant to.